I am not saddened by the recent passing of my grandfather. Rather, I'm compelled to share the way that I knew him best. I would not be here today if not for him. The entity came for me when I was 8 years old, and there was no way that I could have survived if anyone else had been driving. My grandfather and I were on a fishing trip that day. My dad had intended on joining us, but something had come up, and so it was just the two of us for the first time. I was a little awkward around my grandfather because I'd never actually been alone with him. I'd always watched others interact with him, but had little to say myself because I was only 8. I was also in awe of how he was to be my dad the way that my dad was to me. Namely, a voice of authority. When my grandfather told me about the different types of fish and what baits to use, I listened like it was the most important thing in the world. It turned out to be a good thing that I took his words so seriously. That acceptance would later save my life. It began very innocuously, as we walked through a small gorge to get back to the car from the prime fishing spot. I could hear my grandfather's voice echo from the high rock walls, and while he packed things into the car, I had several minutes to wonder why, and I used them to run back to the area and shout. And strangely, my yell echoed only feebly once, and then not at all. Scream as I might, I heard no reflection of the noise. And I was too young at the time to really understand how impossible that was. I just assumed that I was yelling wrong somehow, or that my grandfather had a special grown-up timbre that allowed his voice to echo while mine just dropped off. And still, it bothered me, and I eventually brought it up on the drive back. Everything about that moment became seared into my memory. It was 3:22 in the afternoon by the clock in the car's dashboard. The sky was mostly clear with traces of white, and my grandfather's eyes were wide orbs of alarms turned upon me while his white knuckles tightened around the wheel. "What did you say, boy?" "I asked how I can echo like you," I told him, suddenly afraid that I'd done something wrong. "I yelled and I couldn't echo." His face was normally crisscrossed with little lines that ran their way along relaxed, droopy skin. But at that moment, his forehead and cheeks tightened to smoothness, and he scanned left and right rapidly. He didn't seem to find what he was looking for through the windows, but he did not seem reassured. "Here." He leaned over and opened the glove box in front of me to pull out a bag of jelly beans. I smiled for a moment, but he wasn't giving them to me as a gift the way that he intended. "Eat them all." I held the bag in my hands. It seemed a massive feast. If I'd been left to my own devices, I might have eaten them all eventually, but not all at once. "Why?" "Eat them all, boy," he said gruffly, his tone brooking no argument. And I began stuffing the jelly beans in my mouth. He looked down at me and then down around the back seat, then had his travel thermos and the cup holder between us. He thrust it into my hands to join the spilling bag of jelly beans. "Drink this. All of it. Your mother will understand. Drink it. I know it tastes bad, but down it all." His gaze refocused on something beyond me, and I turned my head to my window to see the forested hills rolling by at various apparent speeds based on their distance. The furthest hills at the horizon hardly seemed to be moving at all, but I thought I saw a tiny little speck atop one. And my grandfather gripped my shoulder with one hand. "Drink, boy, drink, and eat those jelly beans. You need the sugar and the caffeine. It's going to try to make you fall asleep. Don't let it." To say that I was scared then would be an understatement. No part of me thought that this was a prank of some sort. He was too reserved and austere a man for that. The coffee tasted horrible, but I gulped it down until none was left. And after that, I began swallowing jelly beans whole until they were all gone. And I looked to my right. The speck in the distance was still out there, but now one range of hills closer. It was still tiny, but now held movement akin to something waving back and forth. and I looked to my grandfather in askance. He in turn looked away from the thing in the distance to focus on my face. He breathed in through his nose and turned forward, determined in a way that I'd never seen him. His legs moved and the car began to accelerate. We'd already been going the speed limit on the empty highway. And the sugar, the caffeine, and fear began to have an effect on me. I remember my cheeks and forehead warming and my hands growing clammy, and I asked, "What's going on? I'm scared." "Be scared," he breathed, his eyes on the road as he continued to hit the gas. I could see the needle passing 80. "That'll keep you awake. This thing, this godforsaken thing, it came for your grandmother, and it started the same way, just before a long drive. We noticed her voice stop echoing." His face contorted into a furious mask. "But cars are a lot better now than they were back then. I won't let it get you." My back began forcefully pressing into my seat as he put the gas to the floor. I watched the needle pass 90 and then I looked out the window again. It was even closer now visible as the silhouette of a man running up hills, between trees and over boulders parallel to us. "It's still out there," my grandfather grunted angrily and audibly slamming his foot down. I held onto my armrest and the door handle in terror as our car topped 100 miles an hour and began to shake. It felt like we were in a barely controlled projectile far beyond any limit of safety, and I was terrified that the highway would suddenly stop being empty and we would smash into a car or a truck ahead. But even through that overwhelming fear and adrenaline, a chill tiredness began to seep up my spine, and my eyes began to feel heavy, and I blearily looked to my right. And then the shock woke me back up. It was on the gravel shoulder of the highway now, completely visible as a black humanoid silhouette running at incredible speeds along our car. In that moving pitch darkness, I could see little pinpoints that made it feel as if it were gazing into the night itself. The afternoon sun burned into the sky above, and behind it with no effect. Staring at its blurred feet began to pelt across the painted lines at the edge of the road. I felt sleepy again. It was running parallel to us, but drawing even closer. "Wake up!" my grandfather screamed, risking one hand off the wheel at 110 miles an hour to shake my shoulder. "It's trying to drain the life out of you! Wake up!" He jerked the car one lane to the left and still pressed into my seat by the acceleration. I stared down at the hypnotic dashes in the middle of the road. Bit by bit, black feet began landing between each dash, keeping pace with us. And I remember the car shaking violently around me the way that I imagined a space shuttle lifting off might around its astronauts. I now know why we were crossing 120 and nearing the most that the car could offer. But at that time, I was caught in watching the hypnotic dashes and stars in those void legs, moving rapidly back and forth as it ran right up alongside the car and reached down with one hand in to open the door. Wind blasted around me as the gale force of 125-mile-an-hour winds tore at my clothing and hair. Waking up halfway, I screamed, and my grandfather jerked the car to the left again as much as he could without going off the road. It didn't matter. The running silhouette held the door open again against the wind with its star-filled arm and began preparing to leap into the car with us. The other arm gripped my neck, and the cold that it brought could not be described with mere words. The closest I can come to is to say that the vast speeds and the forces of an antithesis cosmos hated me. And somewhere, ice and anti-life were the rule, moving through emptiness at absurd velocities. And this thing was some small part of that undead will, but it was not fully here. It could only interact with us in certain windows. That's what I believe now. My grandfather gave the only shout of fear that I would hear from him as the car seemed to be shaking apart around us. And I looked left at the speedometer and found the needle to be unreadably far out into the red, and felt the heavy blanket of sleep fall over me as the silhouette grasped repeatedly, but failed to reach me. The door slammed shut, cutting off the wind. And inch by inch, we began pulling away. It ran furiously alongside, but the entity was just a tiny bit too slow. And between one moment and the next, realizing it couldn't get us, it vanished. We escaped it. And I awoke in a hospital several days later. My grandfather told nobody the real story, of course, but the doctors had plenty of diversion. Somehow I'd been drained of a number of vital electrolytes, salts, and so on. And they chalked my coma up to some sort of severe dietary imbalance. But I knew the truth. And I made sure to tell the people that I care about the small piece of advice that my grandfather taught me. I don't care if it makes sense to you. Just listen. It's out there still in the open land of the Midwest. And it's probably always been there. It was just never a problem before we started bringing great speeds into our daily lives. People die every day by falling asleep at the wheel. And I know for certain that not all of those accidents are innocent. If your voice stops echoing, cancel your trip. It's waiting for you. A single day added onto my sentence meant the difference between a normal jail and the unending nightmare of Pembinina prison. I was supposed to get out in 364 days. That was the deal. But the judge didn't like my attitude, whatever the hell that meant. So he made it 365. Boom. 1 year was the minimum for prison. My lawyer made a stink and a half, but it didn't do any good. It's not his fault. In fact, he's the one who's going to release the statement to the press, or leak it online if the Guardian Corrections Group or the GCG tries to get an injunction on us. People have to know what happened at Pembinina prison. Now, I'm going to put it right out there and tell you that it was haunted. You think I'm joking. Maybe even I'm nuts or I'm lying, but you got no idea. Haunted prisons aren't anything like you imagine. Those places that advertise themselves and give people tours are sick jokes compared to the real thing. It got so bad that you can actually look up GCG's official filing for Chapter 11. That shit put them out of business on their very first prison. And right there on the briefs, using an early statute of North Dakota law from 1857 to file an insurance claim, it said, "Site of Pembinina prison confirmed by governor's office and 2 notary publics, witnessing in person to be afflicted by the supernatural such that continued business is impossible." It wasn't the first time that prison was closed for that reason. But leeches kept buying it and reopening it and hoping to make a buck off the common man. And I was shoved into that hellhole without knowing the history even a single bit. Now don't get me wrong, the building itself wasn't so bad, especially for something straight out of 1853. It was a big stone cube that was squat, heavy and cramped, but way less sealed off than modern prisons. We could see a lot of the cells around us. There was only one main hallway per floor, and we were close enough to pass things between the bars and have some real human interaction. It could have been worse. There were 5 floors and capacity for 500 prisoners. And when I first got there, I had a bunch of cellmates, and I heard there were 2,000 guys locked up. And I believed it. But that soon changed. I didn't talk to anyone for the first 3 weeks. I'd never been to real prison before, and I was messed up over it. I didn't want to accept that I would be in this place and stuck with 3 other guys in my cell for an entire year. The whole prison seemed full of feral men. The bottom floor would start screaming and hollering and panicking in the middle of the night all at once. And we were on the top floor, but we could hear their screams echoing through the open old layout like they were right there with us. And I just thought the prisoners on the bottom floor were all nuts until the guards were there to wake us up the first day on my 4th week. And when I woke up in my corner without some asshole guard banging on the bars of our cell, I finally had to talk. I asked one of my cellmates, Dante, what was going on. And I'll never forget the fear in his voice, as he said something that should have made us all incredibly happy. Guards are all gone, man. The prisoners were talking quietly between the cells and loudly between the floors through various whispers and shouts. But the most that we could figure out was that something on the first floor had made them all quit in protest. Sure, must have been the crazies screaming like that during the night, right? Except none of us could get any word from the bottom floor. It was dead silent down there. The guys on the second called out for hours. Someone was down there, they said, because they could hear shuffling footsteps walking around at random every so often. But whoever it was never said a single word. That was the first time Dante mentioned the crazy stories from the first floor. He muttered that he hoped that none of it was true, but when I asked about it, he just shook his head. Nothing, man. None of it ever made sense. We were a little worried as the day wore on and nobody came in to let us out for breakfast. And then nobody came to let us out for lunch. The time that we usually got to spend outside in the yard came and went, and people began getting restless. In the cell to our left, Dante's friend Will began telling guys to pass the word that we should all calm down and start sharing any food that we had holed away. And I remember asking Dante, is it really that bad? They've denied meals in yard time for a day or two before, he told me. But the other 2 guys in our cell didn't look convinced. And one of them said, not like this. They made damn sure that we knew what we did. They never just up and left. Someone handed us pieces of crusty old bread through the bars. It was much appreciated. The new guards didn't show up for work for another full day. We got plenty of yard time that day from the new guys, but they seemed more confused than us. We all watched from a distance as Will asked a guard about what happened. And the guard shrugged. I don't know. GCG was paying a premium for fast hires, so I signed up. What about the prisoners on the first floor? Will asked. We could still hear them shuffling around down there. We looked all the way out of the yard, but we couldn't see anyone. Huh? Guard frowned. Nobody in there. They all got transferred. Transferred? The hell that mean? Means DOCR took them back. Returned to state custody since the company couldn't handle them. And that made sense. If the floor had been full of nut jobs, then North Dakota's first local private prison company hardly had the experience to handle them. But these new guys didn't have the skills to handle us. There were half as many guards as before, and they didn't know the routines or who the dangerous ones were among us. And as a result, they were distant, scared, and forceful. All except one guy. Kellen. Kellen wasn't the first guard to treat us like human beings, but by then, he was the only one around. He traded jokes while in the yard, never hit us, and looked us in the eyes when he talked. He went around and found some paperwork to confirm that the crazies had actually been transferred. But it took 3 months to get that info out of GCG. And by the time that he told us that he'd heard back, we sort of forgot the whole thing. And 2 nights later, maybe 2 hours passed lights out. The guys on the second floor began screaming. Dante leapt up and fell on one of our cellmates by accident before shouting, Shit! Shit! It must be a fire! Other guys in our row began banging on the bars and shouting for the guards. But the uniforms charged past and headed downstairs without talking to us. We could hear them shouting orders down below, and then yelling in confusion. The prisoners' screams were clearer coming from the second, and it sounded like they were terrified of something in particular and wanted help. The sound of gates began slamming and people running reached us after about 10 minutes of shouting. And then it was silent. And we sat there in the dark waiting and listening until morning. When the new shift came in, they were surprised and confused, and Kellen came by to ask what had happened. We told him what we knew, but he'd shown up and found open gates and an empty second floor. There was no indication of what had happened, but he promised to check with corporate and to figure out if the absent prisoners had been rapidly transferred again. Dante gripped the bars and made sure Kellen was looking at him.
Please find out who the hell is walking around down there at night.
And Kellen blinked at that.
I mean, I'm day shift, so I don't know what I can do, but what do you mean? The prisoners are gone,
Dante told him fiercely but quietly.
But the guys on the third floor said that they still hear someone, maybe 2 or 3 someones, shuffling their feet every hour or so till morning.
I guess I can go look at that right now. Dante reached through the bars and grabbed his uniform, something which usually got us a beating.
Hear me? Do not go in there by yourself. Stay in the stairwell until someone is with you.
And Kellen nodded fearfully. He looked like he finally understood how spooked we were. And he waved another guard off and Dante let go. But nothing came of it for a whole season. The night shift had quiet, and more guards got hired on at even higher pay. Kellen in another uniform scoped out the first 2 floors, but found nothing. Dante thought it was because they were looking during the day, but he wasn't about to ask our only friend to risk himself. And it was maybe 3 months later. Yeah. I was halfway through my sentence and I had taken up drawing, so I had pen and paper. That's when we woke up in the middle of the night to everyone on the 3rd floor screaming in absolute panic. And this time we were less scared during the event itself. Will offered a guard racing past $500 from his commissary account if the man could come back and tell him what was going on. And Dante listened intently, trying to hear individual screams from the 3rd floor over everyone else's shouting and confusion. And I wrote down any words he had thought that he heard. And what I had written down was,
Jesus Christ. Killing him. God. Let us out. Coming this way.
We weren't as scared when it was happening because we'd lived through it twice before, but this time, the long-term fear was much deeper. Now we knew for sure that it was going to happen again, and any prisoners that had the means began lawyering up and doing everything they could to transfer to other prisons, even if it meant worse conditions. The problem was the North Dakota prison system was already overflowing, which was the whole reason GCG got started in the first place. So every guy that got out meant that it was much harder for the rest of us. Both of our cellmates transferred, giving us more space, so that was nice. But it was a small consolation. Apparently, word had started to spread on the outside, and GCG's solution, instead of paying the guards even more, was to stop having a night shift at all except for just one poor guy. Kellen was a bit miffed that he had gotten a raise out of the whole thing, but he was starting to believe us that something was going on. And by then, he'd been around a while, and he knew that we weren't bullshitters. And too many other prisoners had told him that they heard something walking around the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors at random during the night. It was just a few steps, sometimes as many as 20, but it only happened every so often, and only once it had been long enough that you thought that it had stopped for good. One guy on the 4th floor said that he'd heard a full run from one end of the 3rd floor hallway to the other. Clear enough that he'd expected a guard to come charging up the stairwell, but nobody had appeared. And he ended up slitting his wrists and getting transferred on a medical leave the next day. So, we took him serious. And all that was enough to get Kellen to start doing some research on the outside. He came to us in the 7th month of my sentence with a pale face. Beside us at the bars, Will asked,
"What's the word?"
Kellen seemed grim. "A lot of bullshit out there, but this place is mentioned a lot. It's been closed before, but I keep getting stonewalled when I ask for the historical documents. Thing is, I don't think that the prison itself is the problem. Get this." He pulled out a notepad for reference. 2 Canadian priests, Father Norbert Provencher and Sever Dumoulin, visited Pembina in 1818, before it was even an official township. That was back when the Hudson Bay Company was big around these parts. That's how long ago it was. Pembina was the biggest town in North Dakota then, so the trading post was full. So the priests chose to sleep outside, but where the Pembina River meets the Red River. The folktale has it that a vision of a rotting woman came at night and stole Provencher's life. The 2 men bartered for her to split the remaining life between them, co-signing both to live only 35 years instead of the 70. Sever left. Sever got an extra month and 20 days as a gift from his friend for a sacrifice. And he paused, as if we might guess the obvious outcome. They both died 35 years later. I knew Pembina prison had a horrible problem, but that didn't mean that I had to believe anything.
"Let me guess. A month and 20 days apart?"
Kellen nodded, and Dante snorted. "It's true, dude," Kellen insisted. "The dates of death are right on the Wikipedia. But get this, 35 years after 1818 made their death year 1853, the year that this prison was built, and the place that they camped that night, by the meaning of the rivers." I didn't know what it meant, but I was beginning to feel very uneasy.
"It's right here, isn't it?"
And he was dead serious. "I think there's some shit here. Ancient shit. I asked a guy I knew, and he's got Chippewa relatives over at Turtle Mountain. They know the history of the Red River better than anyone else. He said his uncle told him to never sleep at the meeting of the Red River and the Pembina River. He said that something lives here, under the ground, and awakens with the changing of the seasons." We were silent for a beat after that. It was folktale nonsense, but it was as good as a theory as any. Whatever it was going to come back. And it wasn't friendly. And Will talked to Kellen for another few minutes, but Dante was silent. And after he was gone, I asked him, "What's wrong?" He sat at one of the now unused bunks and told me,
"I got another 5 years in here. I ain't got no money for a lawyer. Your sentence will be up before it reaches us. And I'll be here alone."
There was no way to be sure.
"It'll be back in 2 months for the 4th floor, and then 3 months after that for us. I could get out a week before or a day too late. It doesn't seem to be exact."
And he just looked at the floor.
"What I mean is, I do hope that you get out before it comes." "Oh."
I wasn't sure what else to say after that, so I just sat in my corner like I always did. It wasn't too much after that we heard GCG was going under. The mad rush of transfers had pissed off the state and lost the company a vital contract for a second location, and investors had pulled out or something. The number of guards was cut and then slashed, and Kellen took a pay hit to stay on as the only good guard on the day shift. There's only 20 prisoners left on the 4th floor, he told the 20 of us remaining as the general week that we expected that it would happen approached. Feel like I should stay late just to see what the hell is going to go on down here. But the former guards I asked about it are all too terrified as hell and refused to talk. Some got violent just because I asked.
It's cool, Will told him. You got a kid at home. Don't be here for it.
And the 20 of us left on the 5th floor sat in our cells once night fell, praying and listening. And on Monday night, nothing happened. The 2 guys down below occasionally shouted up at us that everything was clear. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. The strain was growing, though, and we could sometimes hear them breathing rapidly down there. I could only imagine the adrenaline rushing through them every minute until dawn. On Wednesday night, nothing happened. Yet something had changed in the air. The prison was much quieter now that the 2,000 men had become 22. And I thought I could feel the subtle sort of heartbeat in the air, pounding against reality like it was a thin sheet of paper.
It's just your imagination,
Dante whispered. None of us were willing to speak louder than that. And on Thursday night, the heartbeat became a feeling of footsteps approaching from a great distance.
Hey guys,
Will shouted from his cell.
You good down there? Still here,
one responded from down below.
I could feel it. It's at the door. Knocking. What the hell is that supposed to mean?
But the man below did not respond. Friday night. That was the night that it would happen. All day, the 2 guys on 4th floor pulled and clanged at their bars, begging to be let out. And Kellen was torn. And after 2 hours of listening to their pleading, he came up with an idea and transferred both of them up to our floor. If nobody's on 4, he said happily, then we'll all be safe, right? And out loud, we agreed. But we were kidding ourselves. And when the night guard showed up, he freaked and took the 2 men back down. He said out loud what we were all thinking.
If nobody's on 4, then it'll just come right to 5 and get us all. What the hell was Kellen thinking?
We had to listen to the hours of sobbing that night. It was the hardest trial of my life. I wanted to call out to the night guard. I wanted to ask him to get those men out of there. But if I did, I knew whatever was coming would come to us instead. And the moment it happened was a cold hand on my shoulder.
What's going on down there?
Dante shouted. The man who was not sobbing called back.
It's changing!
Will demanded.
What's happening? Tell us! It's red! Red? It's red! What's red?
Will yelled insistently.
God damn it! What's red?
And we stared down the hallway at the night guard, who stood listening with fear. The screaming began a few seconds later. This time only 1 floor above. We could clearly hear their every word. The sobbing prisoners shrieked,
There! It's there!
The man who had been communicating with us began incoherently raging with fear against his bars. And then, strangely, he stopped. And the 20 of us clung to our bars, unable to help, unable to flee. Many of us cried, but we were otherwise silent. For to yell would be to drown out the last words of the men below. But they were eerily quiet for nearly 2 hours. We waited in strained silence as random footsteps traversed to the 4th floor every so often. What was happening? And for the first time, the victims of whatever was going on down below had chosen to be quiet, instead of yelling for help.
Why would that make things different?
And at long last, the sobbing man broke the silence.
Oh my god. It's coming your way! Shut up! It'll see you! Distracted! Hit your bars!
And the sound of clanging echoed up the stairwell. And the sobbing man said with terror,
It knows! It knows! Jesus Christ, do something!
and we were no longer silent. We echoed that sentiment loudly and repeatedly to the guard, do something. And he just stood there, literally quaking in his boots. And Will screamed at him,
Snap out of it! The other guards of the prisoners got away, you can too! Whatever it is, it won't follow you if you let them out and leave!
and I shouted.
They're gonna die down there!
Dante threw his shoe, and the impact finally snapped the man out of his terror. And the guard ran to the stairwell and descended, and the first thing we heard him say was taken aback.
Oh, Mary, Mother of Christ!
And the sobbing man again.
Over here, for God's sake, let us out!
The other prisoner wasn't talking for some reason. We could hear his gasping terror, but that too went quiet. Then we heard a buzzer, and all of the gates on 4 slammed loudly open. The sounds of panting, running, and someone dragging something followed. And the prison went silent. And just like that, we were all alone again. The formerly crowded prison now felt terrifyingly large and empty, with only 20 of us and no guards. And that night, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from down below. I counted time as best I could. 40 minutes. Then someone took 3 steps out of a cell and into the hallway. An hour and 6 minutes. Someone ran 10 steps along the hallway and stopped abruptly. 28 minutes. The footsteps approached the stairwell but then turned into the cell and went silent. Thing was, whoever it was sounded barefoot. And the starting and stopping locations, they didn't match. Where they ended was often nowhere near where they began again later. And by the time that dawn came, we were scared into motionless, terrified silence. And it took Kellen's arrival for us to begin stirring again. With the GCG in bankruptcy court, we no longer had a night guard at all. If it came for us, there would be nobody left to let us out of our cells like everyone else. We hardly talked. We hardly ate. Each passing day was a grain of sand falling through an hourglass marking our executions. Our fellows began confessing to crimes that they hadn't committed just to get transferred to Supermax out of state. The only option left. All that. Or sewer slide attempts. And one by one, Kellen escorted or dragged guys out of our floor. 20 became 15. And then 10. And then it was just me and Dante, with Will still in his cell to our left. The 3 of us and Kellen. 4 men waiting for doom. We sat playing card games in the weeks leading up to it. It would be 1 full year for me in that place. But I could swear that I spent a lifetime in that cell. I couldn't think. Couldn't remember life before. Couldn't imagine surviving after. And every day I prayed for a transfer to come in. When North Dakota had gotten sick of our shit, and the judges had stopped hearing cases from Pembonita prison. They didn't know that there were only 3 of us left. Nobody knew. We contacted the media, we phoned the governor's office, we made a ruckus. That was worse than nobody knowing. Turned out that nobody cared. There was nobody higher up at GCG following this situation, and Kellen couldn't get anybody on the phone. Payroll, meaning just his paycheck, was being handled by a third-party disbursement company that couldn't answer questions about ongoing proceedings. And then the week approached. On Monday night, nothing happened. We were like statues in our cells, alone, waiting for a sign of the executioner's approach. When dawn came, we sighed and began moving again. And Dante asked, "You get out Friday?" I nodded. If things went like before, I would be released the day of. And as long as I left before sundown, I would be all right. On Tuesday night, nothing happened. 2 for 2. Just one more. Just one more day. I sat through the darkness until... No. And the feeling of the prison had changed around us. A subtle heartbeat seemed to pulse against our faces and ears and eyes. It had come a day earlier in the week than last time. And that morning, Will patted my arm as we both leaned out the bars. "Sorry, man." Dante shook his head angrily. I wasn't going to get out in time. And on Wednesday night, the heartbeat became the sound of footsteps approaching from some unfathomable distance. I think I stood at the bars of our cell that entire day, fingers wrapped around metal with force to match the tension in the air and in our minds. This couldn't happen. This wouldn't happen. My lawyer would walk in and tell me that he'd gotten the judge's unfair addition of an extra day removed. One day. One goddamn day. Even if I spent a whole year in this prison, one day meant life or death. Let me out. Let me the hell out, for God's sake! But nobody cared. And nobody would listen. The disbursement company fired Kellen and changed the locks on the property. According to the paperwork, all the prisoners had been moved, and they thought that he'd be getting fired for guarding an empty cell. They left us in there for 11 days before the error was found, which meant 11 nights with that thing. For 11 days, we starved. For 11 nights, we sat absolutely still, not daring to move or breathe or even look left or right. It knew where we were. Generally, it stood right outside of our cells for hours, and sometimes walked right through the bars and grasped at the beds around us, daring us to make even the slightest motion. When you've spent 6 hours staring into the blind crimson eyes of a rotting demon, unable to blink your eyes for fear that it will hear the air your lashes move. When you've seen what it's seen, the world that has walked reflected in hellish red, you'll understand. No one cares. I'd like to tell you that Kellen actually existed. I'd like to tell you that we had a friend among the guards, and that it wasn't all bad. I'd like to tell you that I wasn't traumatized by the hell that I went through being left to rot and left to die as nothing more than a number on some corporation's books. But no one cares.